Charles C.J. Buck is president and CEO of Buck Knives Incorporated. He's married with 5 kids who range in age from 23 to 30. Mr. Buck graduated with a bachelor's degree in business administration from the National University in 1982. In 1978, he was hired onto the production line at Buck Knives, and after filling a number of roles over the years, he was promoted to president in 1999. He was appointed to serve 2 terms as a director of the Idaho Economic Advisory Council by 2 separate governors. CJ currently sits on a number of boards, including the Mule Deer Foundation and the Boone and Crockett Club, where he also serves as chair of the Communications Committee. He's a life member of the NRA, the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, Safari Club International, and the Mule Deer Foundation. We're delighted he's able to join us today, and particularly delighted that after he's finished speaking today, CJ is set up in the OFH store down the hall that you all know where it is as you pass it coming down the hall, and he'll be in there engraving the Buck knives that you can purchase for at-cost prices in the store. So without further ado, I'll please welcome CJ Buck.
So making sure that this company continues at the level of an American icon. It's more than just products. It is a heartfelt desire to inspire confidence in people so that if they're out on an adventure in everyday life, they've got a trusted companion that they can depend on. When there's a family name behind it, you just got to pay attention.
I don't have a controller. Oh, I hear. Okay, well, thank you. It is an honor to be here. I thought it'd be fun to start off. Wait, I'm going to get my ventriloquist dummy up here. But I thought it'd be fun to start off with, that's our company commercial for the upcoming year. And there's a couple things, and I'm going to be talking about them later. But that knife, that folding Hunter 110, which is what's pictured in that first slide, we are celebrating the 50-year anniversary of that knife. So I'll touch a little more on that as we go. Probably one of the first points I'd like to mention is that knives are tools. So hunting, camping, fishing, outdoor, tactical, military, law enforcement, whether it be everyday carry or whether it be something that sits on your shelf as an investment or just as a memento, knives begin as tools. And we are a family company. My great-grandfather started making knives in 1902. He was an apprentice blacksmith. That's him in the middle, Hoyt Heath Buck. In the mid-40s, my grandfather had moved to San Diego, California, was raising 4 kids in California, and his parents came to move in with him. So that's kind of a shift to what goes on these days. But his parents came to move in with him, and it was H.H. Buck & Son Lifetime Knives. So the 2 of them were hand-making knives in a lean-to next to my grandfather's garage. My father and my uncle and my grandmother's little baby brother, Chuck Shapter, the 4 of them did the Buck let's see, what was it? It was the Buck Saw and Mower Works. So they would make knives, sharpen saws, tune up lawnmowers. As most little family businesses, whatever it took to keep the wheels running, that's what they did. That's my father and I at the bottom. So we're into 4th generations, and then my son, Josh, he is working in our inventory control department right now, kind of learning the basics of the business. So we're into our 5th generation right now. This was going to be where I was going to play that video, but decided not to. Really 4 key areas of, when you think about what goes into a knife. So you've got the design, and innovative design starts with conversations. So the very reason I'm here and sitting in dinners and sitting at tables with real, true sportsmen is to figure out what do you need, what works, what doesn't work, and take that back with me. That's where innovative design comes from, interacting with the people who are using your products. State-of-the-art materials, the craftsmanship of the people, and then we back it up with a forever warranty. So I've already talked about the 50th anniversary. This is a picture of my grandfather. This is Al Buck. He passed away in 1991. This picture was taken in right in the early 50s. So this picture was actually taken before the knife I'm talking about was invented. But that was him hand-making knives, just putting all that personal integrity into them. And so for the 50 years, we're doing a new thing for us. We're doing a sweepstakes. This will be the end of my Buck propaganda, then I'll go into knife stuff. But we're doing a sweepstakes this year to celebrate a product that survived for 50 years. So we're partnering with Chevy Trucks. We're giving away in November a 2014 Silverado Chevy pickup truck. We had the Laser X-Mark Series lawnmower. They donated that to us to be part of our program. PSC bows, a Marlin trip, a Idaho whitetail trip. So we're having a lot of fun with this. I think we've had over 250,000 entries so far. So just celebrating a family heritage and a dedication and integrity to quality is what we're doing this year. So let's talk about, I get a lot of opportunities to visit with key accounts. They're doing grand openings. I've been to many up here in Canada. I've been to a ton in the US. I've been to some overseas. And again, it's that ability to interact with customers. I find myself helping them choose what would the right knife for them be. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk through some of the criteria that I ask them. And the first thing I ask them is, how are you going to carry this knife? Because the first choice you got to make is, do you want it to be fixed, a fixed blade, or do you want a folder? A fixed blade is safer to use, obviously. That blade, no matter what you do with it, it's not going anywhere. So that a fixed blade is the safest knife to use, while a folder is a lot safer to carry. If you take a bad spill, for those of you that hunt by horseback or even ATV, if you take a bad spill, it's nice to know that that knife blade is all closed up, safe in the handle, and is never going to come through anything to get you. So folders are safer to carry, but a fixed blade is actually safer to use. Another question you have is locking or non-locking. And personally, I don't have a lot of use for non-locking knives. But the one on top there, that's our Alpha Series. It's a liner lock. The one below, the 110, that's a lock back. And I hope, if you're not familiar with those terms, I'm not going to go into it up here. I don't have enough time. But locking keeps that blade from closing on your fingers, obviously. So I would always recommend, if you've got a choice, to do a locking blade. The multi-blade pocket knives that are non-locking are very good for light-duty, everyday type stuff. But if you're in a hunting situation or any type of heavy-duty use, if you're going to go with a folder, it should be locking. High-tech or traditional, again, there's some really neat materials that have been invented of late. They're lightweight, they're very strong, they're impervious to corrosion or denting or any type of deflection. They can handle impact without deflecting and ruining the way a knife would function. So high tech, there's some really good things about high tech. We have a lot of people who just want the traditional weight of a brass knife. They like the way it feels in their hand, so it's a very personal decision. Size. The knife at the bottom, it's called the hoodlum. And it's actually tongue-in-cheek named after Ron Hood, who was an expert survivalist. And he got out of the military. When he got out of the military, he did not follow the martial arts side of his background. He was enamored with the survival skills part of his background. So he went around the world, he embedded himself with indigenous peoples, and he looked, how do folks in the desert, how do they find water? How do they find food? How do folks in the mountains, what do they do? How about in swamps? He would go on islands. He would go all over the world, and he would pick and choose these survival skills and created a course he actually taught in colleges. The one common denominator for every group was that they had big knives. And if you need to survive in the woods, small knives can't do big jobs, but big knives can do small jobs. And so everywhere he went, so he designed that knife. And so I say size is important. You know, from a skinning standpoint, I prefer a shorter blade. I really like a knife that I can get my whole hand around, so that as I'm up working in dark areas that you can't see what you're doing, it's nice to know that the tips of your fingers extend pretty much to the tip of your blade, and you always know where that's going. You're not going to cut yourself by accident. So size, again, it's one of those personal preferences that it's just something people have to make a decision on. I already talked a little bit about how are you going to carry this knife. So you see the knife where are you standing? So you're far left. You know, that's a 110 folding hunter. On the other end of the screen is the sheath for that. So you can carry knives on your belt in a sheath. The knife right next to that is called the Spitfire. It's the little orange one. That's a clip knife, similar to the one pictured next to it, showing that pocket clip. That's a very popular way of carrying, especially an everyday carry knife in your pocket. The knife on the top is a neck knife. So it's got a little plastic sheath. The knife slips into that sheath, locks over that knob, that protruding knob. So it's easy to extract, but you just wear it in a cord around your neck. Just another way to easily carry and access a knife. We sell a lot of those to fishermen, especially wading fishermen, that wearing a bathing suit, no pockets, no belts. They just want to throw something around their neck and have it available. So how you're going to carry is another one of those knife choices. Okay, real quick on knife parts. This is our 119 special. This is a knife that my great-grandfather designed in the early 40s, and we continue to manufacture it. It's changed a little bit. But one of the things I'd like to point out here, when you look at that false edge on the back of the knife, that's called a chamfer. It's not really sharpened, but what we use that for, we use that to thin the tip. And I'll talk about that a little bit later when I get into blade shapes. But just the hollow grind. The hilt is the unhollow ground area. So it's kind of between the sharpened edge and the guard. So the hilt and the choil are kind of the same, describing the same basic area. Then obviously the guard, the handle, and then the butt of the knife. So when you talk about blade shapes, and I know I'm preaching to the choir in here, but this is a skinner. The two main elements that make this a skinning knife is the drop point and the belly of the knife, a nice skinning sweep belly. Those are the two pieces about this blade that make it most effective for skinning. And obviously the drop point, so that as you're running that point between the hide and the meat or muscle below, you don't want a trailing point that's just dragging itself through the meat below. So it just allows you to make a little faster strokes to separate hide from the meat, and then that big rocking belly is most effective for skinning. The clip blade, I talked a little bit about that chamfer. That grind on the back of that blade, when you look at the point on this, it's a very fine puncturing point. So it's a completely different use. It's also a much more vulnerable point than was on the drop point blade. So you have to be really careful when you're prying with a clip blade. We get a lot of blades back with broken tips. And I tell people that the second time you use a knife as a screwdriver, it's a lot more effective. Oh, I'm sorry. Don't change it. You did good. Gut hooks. We went round and round. Is a gut hook a gimmick? Does it work? Is it worthwhile? Because we pride ourselves in not making gimmicks. So we looked at gut hooks for a long time before we decided to introduce one. And I personally don't like gut hooks on the back of knives. I like to carry a gut hook as a separate component. But these work. And it's not so much for the actual gutting, which just isn't that difficult, but it's a lot more effective when you start talking about skinning. The worst thing you can do to your knife blade is have it interact with the hide, because you never really know what those animals have rolled in. You get sand, grit. It's just the worst thing you can do is take the very area that you're going to need once you're inside skinning and dull that area cutting through the hide. And now you're on the inside of an animal with a dull knife, which isn't good. If you take a gut hook and you make a little incision about 1 inch long, and you take the hook of that hook it into the hide, and now you open that hide with the gut hook. Now you go back in and you're actually skinning from the inside. You're keeping your knife blade clear of that hide. And when you get done with that animal, your knife's still going to be sharp, because there's not a whole lot on the inside that dulls a knife blade. So I am finding the gut hooks very, very useful, and more so for skinning than for hunting, than gutting. Caping, and in this regard, I know I'm preaching to the choir. How many trappers we have in here? You guys probably do more caping than anything I've ever done. In fact, I will tell you, I've never completely caped an animal. I always give up about 1/8 of the way through and hand it over to the guide. But obviously, it's scalpel-like in shape. It's got a mild skinning. It's got a mild belly, so you still have a little bit of that skinning rocker blade. You have a nice little fine point. I see a lot of people hold these like pencils, getting in there doing real fine work. So this is a knife that's specifically for caping. I want to talk about serrations. Serrations are a hugely personal issue. I interact with people that would not buy a knife without serrations. I interact with people that wouldn't even consider buying a knife with serrations. What I will say about serrations is, if you're doing something involved with a rope, serrations are a good thing to have. And so this half a serrated blade, half of a straight edge blade is a nice balance if you're doing something that deals a lot with cutting rope, and especially wet rope. But they are hard to sharpen. This is a Tonto blade. It was, this whole shape, this is all about armor piercing. I mean, that's what this blade shape was all about. So the geometry of this blade is, and I wish I had a shot looking down the back of this knife, because you'd be able to see just how much meat there is going right to that tip. So it's designed to puncture steel and be incredibly strong. Now, one of the functional aspects you get out of this blade geometry is that little flat portion on the front of the blade provides a very effective scraping tool, and it just really does. Most bellied knives, you only have a small fraction of the blade touching a flat surface at any given time. So this Tonto blade, from an everyday carry, I don't really carry anything that looks like this, but from an everyday carry, it's got its utility, but it's basically mostly designed for puncturing. We've already talked about clip blades, but a pen blade or a spear blade, And pen blades are actually named because this is a small blade that people would trim, they would retip their quill pens with. So this little blade, that's why it's called a pen blade. The last two blades are sheep's foot and spay, and you guys probably know more about spaying than I ever will, but it's just a blade for castrating farm animals, and it has a very blunted tip because you did not want to do any more damage than was absolutely necessary. And then on the sheep's foot is, it combines two utilities. It's a completely flat cutting blade, so there's no sweeping at all. It's completely flat, and it's got that very aggressive tip, kind of a scoring tip. And one that I don't have a picture of, but there's a hawkbill blade, like a tile cutting type knife, where the tip actually comes down, and that's just a more aggressive sheep's foot blade. We're getting into the fun stuff now. Knives really are, when you start talking about blades, knives are a compromise of three different utilities or performance characteristics. So it's edge retention, corrosion resistance, and ductility, or just the ability to take an impact and not shatter. You're always compromising amongst those three. And there's two things that drive that. It's the material you start with and the heat treating that you do. And I'm going to talk a little more about heat treating. Heat treating is before I do that, when you think about corrosion resistance, you think about a diving knife, something pure stainless, no carbon in it whatsoever. It's going to be completely corrosion resistant, and you could almost bend it with your fingers. It's going to be so soft. So there are certain compromises where if you put carbon in it so that you can harden it, it will now corrode. And depending on how you heat treat it, if you heat treat it hard, it's obviously going to be more brittle. If you leave it softer, it'll be more ductile. So that's what I mean about, as you're talking about how you want that knife blade to perform when you're done, there's a lot of pieces that go into it with what material you choose and how you heat treat it. Okay, so now we'll talk about heat treating. Buck Knives has been doing our own heat treat in-house since 1969. It's that important. So consistency. I talk a little bit about attention to detail. Consistent heat treat is crucial. And I'll talk about what we're doing in heat treat. Heat treat is a three-step process. It's a high heat, followed by an extreme cold, followed by a medium heat for an extended period of time. So those are the three steps. What you're doing in the first two steps, the high heat and the extreme cold, is you're actually creating molecules. So to give you an example, if you take water and you add heat, what you're doing is you're separating those molecules. If you take water vapor and you cool it, which is another temperature variant, if you cool it, you are combining atomic elements that were not bound together to begin with. You're binding them together, and you're getting a different performance characteristic. You're getting a liquid, whereas before you had a gas. Heat treat does something very similar. It actually takes the elements that are within the steel and recombines them. And so you take a carbon, you combine it with a chromium atom, you get a chromium carbide molecule that is resistant to corrosion, where that carbon atom by itself was just looking to be oxidized and rust. Now you've inhibited that. So if you do the heat treat right, you're taking the elements that were initially baked into the mix, which that comes from the steel company, and I'll talk about steels in a second. You are taking what you have and making the most connections possible. So just because we or some other company is using the same material doesn't mean you're going to get the same performance characteristics out of that steel. So that's the importance of heat treat. The pictures that are up here I'm showing you, this is about tempering. This is that final process. So the first two processes are creating molecules. The last process is aligning those molecules in a structure that is not brittle. And that's where the tempering and the whole concept of, tempering, toughness, that's where that comes from. So the first two processes create molecules. The last process creates structure. And if you do this right, you've gotten the most edge retention ability, you've got the most corrosion resistance, and you've optimized the ductility in a material. And so when you talk about the spirit of a knife, the heat treat is just critical. Again, these are things that happen if you don't heat treat properly. That top right-hand corner, if you look at that discoloration, those are inclusions. Those are areas where the material itself did not, in a nice homogeneous fashion, you didn't get a good mix throughout the steel. You didn't get your connections properly. You have little pods of material that create stress fractures throughout, and you can see that knife. It was a hugely thick bladed knife, and yet it was totally corrupt inside, and it was totally invisible to the person who bought that knife, and it wasn't a Buck knife, by the way, but I made sure they didn't have any logos on there. So if you look through here, down at the bottom, that's corrosion, brittleness along the edge. There's a lot of opportunity to screw up if you don't do your heat treating correctly. These are the steels that we use. We have 4 steels. I prefer the S30V, which is at the top. It's a high vanadium steel, and I don't know why, but the vanadium in the mix tends to just, the molecules hold on to themselves, so as you're using the knife, you're just not leaving a trail of blade behind you. Those molecules are hanging on to themselves. So with the S30V, we're able to get really good edge retention and still retain a lot of ductility because it doesn't have to be as hard. So S30V is my favorite steel. 154 CM is a very high carbon steel. It's incredibly hard to sharpen, but holds an amazing edge. It's just a little more brittle than the S30V. The 420HC, 420 is a kitchen knife steel, so it's got amazing corrosion resistance built into it. The HC stands for high carbon, and it has far less carbon than the 2 steels up above, but it has more than a kitchen knife. It allows us to get that steel hardened to where it makes a wonderful hunting knife, but you still have amazing corrosion resistance. And then the last one is the 5160, which is what we were laughing about, that hoodlum, the big machete-looking knife. That knife's built out of 5160 because it's designed to just beat the snot out of it. And that's what that material does so well. I wanted to mention one thing about corrosion resistance. When you think about a razor-sharpened knife and how thin that edge is, it doesn't take a lot of corrosion to take that edge off. So there are times I tell people, if you use your knife a lot, you'll do better off with one of the more higher maintenance but higher edge retention materials. If you do more carrying of your knife and you just need it to respond when you need it and you don't need it that often, sometimes the corrosion resistance will be a better edge retention for you than a harder steel. So I tell people that. So sharpening. Sharpening is about 2 things. It's about the direction. You're always cutting into the stone. Either way, you're never dragging your knife blade back and forth across the stone. You're always cutting into the stone, and you're maintaining your angle. And that's how we measure angle. So a 13 to 16 degree angle, that's how high up you want to lift the back of your knife blade off of the stone you're using. And I tell people it was my grandfather's test, and what he would do is to help people get feedback on how they were sharpening. He would tell them, take a felt pen, actually paint the bevel of your knife, take a few strokes on the stone, and now look at it. And if you're holding the knife too high on the stone, you will see, if you go to that top corner picture there, you will have cleaned away the felt pin on the bottom of your edge, but you'll still have black on the top of it. So you haven't laid your edge flat on that stone yet. You're raising your knife blade up too high. If you hold the knife blade down too low, or if you're laying it too flat on the stone, you're gonna be spending a lot of time grinding on the top of your edge, but you're never really touching the edge itself. And so you're gonna work on it forever, and it's never gonna feel like it's just not getting sharper. Well, it's because you're not at the right angle. And then the Goldilocks approach, too high, too low, just right. That last one is if you've painted that blade and you've taken a couple strokes and you've cleaned all the felt pen off, that's exactly the angle that you want to maintain. And if you're doing sharpening correctly, it should not take you more than 4 or 5 minutes to sharpen a knife. I mean, especially from a meat cutting edge, not a shaving or a whittling, carving type edge. But if you're just trying to put a good medium grit, meat cutting edge back on that knife, if it takes you more than 4 or 5 minutes, you're not holding your angle correctly. Another thing I'll share with you really quickly is when you're taking a stroke along that stone, you're looking for a very consistent drag. If you lift the knife up a little bit, the edge is going to drag, it's going to catch, and you're going to feel it. If you drop the knife down too low, the top of your edge bevel is going to catch and drag. And so if you're just very sensitive and cognizant of just a consistent feel, so you'll be doing it correctly. And you want that sweet spot. You just want a nice consistent feel as you're sharpening. These are a couple different methods. So just quickly to define them, but more and more people are going to mechanized, electric or battery-powered sharpeners, and they work perfectly fine. The only limitation they have is the only edge angle you have is what's built into the machine itself. So when we sharpen knives at Buck, we have a thought process of how is this knife going to be used? So fillet knives get a little more dramatic angle than that hoodlum we showed up there, because that's going to be pounding through trees and branches. It's going to have a little fatter edge. The fillet knife's going to have a thinner edge. So we adjust the angles, and I would say to you, your best bet is to duplicate the angle that's already on the knife, because there was some thought that went into that. So that's the only drawback. And it's minor, but that's the only drawback to these mechanized. They work perfectly fine otherwise. The one on the top there, that's a diamond stone. There are two quality aspects when you're looking at diamond sharpening stones. One is the quality and consistency of the diamond itself. And two, the way those sharpeners are made, they lay that powder of diamond on the steel, and then they nickel plate over the top of that. And it doesn't adhere to the diamond, because nothing adheres to diamond, but it adheres to the steel underneath, and it just glues and locks the diamond in place. So as you're sharpening, a well-made diamond sharpener should never wear out. The only way a diamond sharpener wears out is that nickel plating gives way and allows the diamond to fall free of the steel. So if you've got a good quality diamond and a good quality plating process, you will have a sharpening tool that'll last you forever. And so that's just what to keep up. Price differences between sharpening implements, that's the quality element to keep in mind. The one below that is a natural stone. The way and these are called honing stones or oil stones. The way the stones work, if you think about the geometry of the stone itself, it's like a honeycomb. And as you sharpen, you're wearing away that stone. So you have these honeycombs. When you break through the top of a bubble, you expose two new cutting edges. And so a stone is always sharpening itself because it's always releasing new cutting edges. And so the diamond just never wears away. The stone wears away, but is always releasing new cutting edges. The issue with a stone is after a while, you get that nice worn belly in that stone, and that becomes an impediment to sharpening after a while. So anyway, so that's the normal stone. The other thing I've got up there is a steel. Steels themselves, like a butcher steel, they do not remove very much material. So you'll see a meat cutter do something and then really quick and then go back to cutting. At some point, he's got to take that knife aside and actually sharpen it because the steel is not resharpening, it's just resetting that edge. And that down in the corner is a crock stick. And the theory behind the crock stick is you've got those two posts, and they could be anything. They can be ceramic, they can be diamond, they can be aggressive, they can be fine. But what that's doing is that's fixing an angle for you. So you as a consumer now can just focus on holding that knife perfectly straight up, and the angle of the post itself helps you maintain the angle in the sharpening. So that's really what a crock stick is all about. We talked a little bit about serrations. The beauty, glory of sharpening serrations is you get to do them one at a time. Every individual little pocket in there, you get to sharpen one at a time. And consider a gut hook as just one big giant serration. So it's really the same way. And on these, that felt pin test works really good because what you're trying to do when you're sharpening these, you don't want, how do I do this? You want you want that angle to go all the way to the edge. You don't want to create a new little mini edge. Does that make sense? You want that flat to run all the way to the edge. So doing this is another time when the felt pin is very helpful to make sure that you're cleaning that ramp consistently all the way to the edge. And what I do is I hold the knife edge pointing away from me, and I lay a conical sharpener. And that's what's pictured up there is it starts thick and just runs to a thinner point. You just lay that in there as far as you need to fill the space you're sharpening and pull it back to you. That's how you sharpen a serration. And it's a pain in the butt, but the beauty is because of the serrations, the little teeth, the points, take all the abuse. So you've seen the Ginsu knives that cut nails, then turn around and cut tomatoes. What's happening is those points are riding along the nail. The edges are up, protected. And now when you start cutting something softer, the teeth can penetrate into the material far enough that the edges can now come into play. So serrations, like steak knives on your plates, on the dinner plates, that's why steak knives are all serrated, so that the edge itself is not running on the plate. The tops of the teeth are on the plate, but the edges are protected. Anyway, so that's all about serrations and sharpening fish hooks. I was born and raised in San Diego, California. We did a lot of saltwater fishing, and it was the difference between fish or no fish. If you resharpened the hooks on your jigs or just let them or didn't, it made a difference. So anyway, that tool, with the red handle, it's just got little mini grooves, allows you to just take the hook and just resharpen those hooks, which is important. That's all I can think of. Any questions on anything I've said? Yes, sir.
What's the value of stropping your knife?
Stropping is very good. Stropping is a polishing, and and stropping is very. Everybody familiar with stropping? Just a leather strap. And what you're doing is you're polishing that blade. You're making it very effective for shaving hair, and you're making it less effective for cutting meat. Because when you sharpen a knife, the act of sharpening leaves scratches on your blade. Those scratches will continue to cut even when the blade itself is not completely sharp. So like I said, it works well for shaving or wood carving where the sharpness is that critical, but it diminishes the longevity of the edge itself when you're doing something more aggressive. But it's a perfectly valid technique. It delivers what it's supposed to deliver.
On your favorite knife, what Rockwell unit are you using?
The S30V, we hardened to 60.5 Rockwell. C, yeah. And the 420HC, we hardened to around 58. The 5160, we hardened to around 58. It could be harder. We purposefully under-harden it because we're going after the ductility. It's a whacking machine. It didn't need to be harder or more brittle. And the 154 CM is running about 61 to 62 Rockwell. Yes, sir?
I've got a butt folding knife that I've had since the late 70s. The leather sheath worn off a long time ago, and I can't find a replacement. So where can I find a replacement sheath for the knife?
Just give me your card. So I'll be in the store next door for the rest of the afternoon, and we'll just send you one. Good. Thank you very much.